Ultraman Ball on the Game Boy. Like last week's Painter Momopi, this is another one of those fabled import Japanese Game Boy games that I fell in love with last year and have been desperately searching for a copy ever since. However, unlike Painter Momopi, this one's a bit more of a mixed bag, I think. The story of Ultraman, at least what I'm capable of parsing through like the two series we got, one of which being entirely Australian, so, take that for what it is about some alien life form accidentally killing a human being, and in order to give him the life he has taken, fuses with him to become the almighty Ultraman. However, he's only capable of existing for about 3 minutes at a time, so as to show up in the most crucial moments of any episode, and save the day in the climax to keep the ratings up. The story of Ultraman Ball presupposes that instead of killing a human being, it instead murdered a helpless rubber ball and decided to fuse with it, thus becoming Ultraman Ball. Yeah. The best analogy for gameplay I can describe for Ultraman Ball is, well, remember that Famicom platformer I reviewed a while back, Armadillo? It's kinda like that. And for those uninitiated, first of all, go watch that video, but second of all, it's a platformer that takes place as two different forms. You have the Ultraman character, as well as the Ultraman rubber ball morph ball mode, for lack of a better term. The idea is that you start at point A in a sort of semi-constructed maze 2D platformer situation, and you have to sort of navigate through this obstacle course to find the exit at the end of the stage, all while collecting power-ups, freeing aliens which give you extra health, defeating enemies, and trying desperately not to get murdered by things that come at you way too fast. It kinda happens a lot. Now, the actual forms of Ultraman and Ultraman Ball are slightly different. Ultraman moves a little bit slower than the ball and is capable of climbing vines as well as climbing walls in a sort of Mega Man X-esque wall jump kick maneuver, which allows him to sort of get around the more vertical bits of environment a little bit safer than the ball form. Whereas the ball form is typically faster, it's able to jump significantly higher, which means it can land on free-flowing blocks a little bit easier than the Humanoid Ultraman, as well as being completely invulnerable to spikes, as well as most enemies. I want to highlight that most enemies. Some of them can still hurt you in your semi-indestructible form for reasons. Now, what is interesting about these two forms is that they kind of handle a little bit differently. I mean, you'd kind of expect the Ultraman Ball form to handle slopes a little bit differently with sort of a pseudo-sphere physics, and it does, but more importantly, on a base level, it's just a lot more slippery to control, which can be a little bit tricky for the more precise platforming aspects of the game. Now, the nice thing is the actual precision platforming bits only show up in 1 or 2 levels, so it's not that big a deal, but you might get stuck on them just by virtue of, no, I need to land on that one little bit, why did I just roll off even though I stopped? Damn it! Lost another life. But that gets compounded with a greater problem, which is the standard humanoid controls, which are just clumsy and inaccurate. Like, it feels like there's a bit of just natural delay to controlling the characters, and that actually carries over to the ball form too, which means not only are you slipping off platforms when you're a ball, you're also slipping off platforms while dealing with delay to your inputs, which means you really have got to be ahead of the curve in terms of controlling yourself and not falling off of a cliff and dying horribly. Other than that, the Humanoid Ultraman is bigger, which means he can't fit through certain tunnels, as well as a little bit slower. However, he's unaffected by slopes and gravity. Well, as much gravity, as well as being unaffected by slopes, which means he's not going to immediately go hurtling into a crevasse or something. So mastery of this game comes mainly from wrestling both with the controls, but also understanding the strengths of both forms. Yeah, you can get around a lot faster as the ball, but it's going to be a lot more imprecise, which means you have to wrestle even more with the controls. Whereas you could swap to the humanoid form where you're a lot more vulnerable, but you've got more control to work with. So there is that. There's also a few power-ups to pick up, mostly just life pickups, but there's also a feather power-up which allows Ultraman in his human form to fly around the environment a little bit, which is very useful in some situations and absolutely necessary in others. So it's real important to make the most of what power-ups you have when you get them, because they are scarce. The one thing you can pick up that isn't entirely scarce, however, is lives. And that's because Ultraman has one hit and he dies. And some of the enemy placement, as I've alluded to, like to sort of just come out of nowhere immediately and kill you. And there's other situations where you really have to kind of trial and error your way through it. Well, the nice thing is there's plenty of lives. Usually when you come across one of those like trial and error places, they put a life nearby. But there's also like this box that seems to contain a UFO for reasons, and if you can break that open, then you suddenly have an extra life. And while every level has an exit, some levels have multiple exits in their sort of like maziness. And if you go through a bonus exit, you get like a mini game where you can get like 5 or so free lives, provided you're good at the mini game. So really, you shouldn't have too much of a problem with lives, with maybe 1 or 2 exceptions, because they just throw lives at you like candy. And well, part of me is very grateful of that. It makes the game pretty easy to beat. It doesn't really make up for the somewhat awkward enemy placement, as well as the fiddly, clumsy controls. Oh yes, and the bosses. Oh boy, the bosses. Okay, so there are 4 bosses in this game. The first one and third one are completely fine. They are sensible bosses that just throw out an enemy, sometimes throw out a couple of attacks, but they're relatively easy to deal with. The second and fourth boss, however, are ridiculously tough, and not for a really sensible reason. The second boss is like this fish that sits on top of the water, and you have to go in between platforms landing directly on top of him to both attack him as well as not get completely murdered by falling through the floor. The problem with this being that while it attacks in a very basic pattern, it has a few different attacks and they're all directly above him. So you have to either play very, very cautiously in order to not completely get yourself killed just trying to do any damage to it, but you also have to learn that suddenly at half health it does a jumping attack, which means evasion is even worse because it suddenly takes a significantly bigger damage area than before. Oh, and then you have to deal with physics so you don't fall through the bottom of the screen when you hit it. It's good in the sense it's a challenge in terms of figuring out where you are and where you land spatially, but at its worst, it's a giant realization that the hit detection in this game is really not in your favor. And oh yes, the fourth boss is terrible. It's a very simple enemy that flies up and down in a horizontal line, just randomly dropping fireballs. The problem being that sometimes you'll go through him when you attack him, so even though you'll do damage, you'll sometimes fall through and get like hit by a follow-up attack, or even on his deathbed when you finally kill him, you might fall through him and get hit by his final attack, which is just another standard fireball that he randomly decided to throw at the time. And I know this because he murdered me no less than 3 times after I beat him. That's not exactly great. But on the bright side, the level design is fantastic. They are kind of maze-like, and they offer multiple exits, a few secrets here and there, some score stuff. It works very well once you get past that sort of awkward enemy placement, and it really does afford to let you have fun with the mechanics, as well as explore different routes if you're not particularly good at one specific area. So you know what? Even though half the bosses are terrible, and even though the controls are very, very clumsy, I still like the gameplay to this. I love the level design, and the mechanics are pretty fun, for the most part anyway, leading to some decent gameplay, provided you're up for a little frustration. The overall presentation to Ultraman Ball is, you know what? I think it looks pretty good. I like the SD chibi characters. I like the goofy titular Ultraman Ball. I think the bosses look great, and the environments are decent, if a little bit bland. I could use 2 or 3 more different like texture styles or something, but overall the environments are passable. And the soundtrack is, it's alright, you know? It has the Ultraman theme, which I think is basically all you really need, and that's good because there's only like 2 other songs and they're mostly forgettable. But they're at least upbeat and catchy, so while they're not terribly memorable, they're at least decent, leading to an overall fairly solid presentation. Now, if you want to get Ultraman Ball on the Game Boy, pricing-wise, this game seems a little bit schizophrenic. I've only seen 3 or 4 copies on eBay ever, and the first copy I ever saw was $10. And I tried to buy that, and as it was in my cart and I was ready to pay for it, someone bought it. The next copy I saw was, I'm not joking, $90, as was the third copy I saw. Whereas the fourth copy, the one that I'm playing here, ended up costing about $30. So it's kind of all over the place in terms of cost. and given the fact that I've only seen like 4 copies over the course of a year and a half means they're probably not super common, but it also seems that people don't really know what to charge. So finding a copy might only be half the battle here, just depending on the whim of the seller. And honestly, for $30, it seems a little bit high in terms of the actual game you're getting. It's not very long, there's 4 worlds, and the first 3 worlds have 5 levels, with the 5th one being the boss. The 4th world has twice as many levels because it reuses all the previous bosses because padding. But the gameplay itself is decent, and if you can get it for a cheap price, it's not bad. It's nowhere near as good as Painter Momopi, but for a superhero handheld exclusive game about a superhero turned rubber ball, it could have been a lot worse.